Boldwood presents Mayhem in the Mountains, written by Kelly Oliver and read by Willow Nash. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. The Cortina. Waiting was deuce distracting. Where was the scoundrel? He was supposed to be here yesterday, and he was never late. Bloody war. It was trying my patience. I gave up pacing and resigned myself to rereading the latest issue of Detective Story magazine. I'd just settled into a chair in front of the fireplace when Kitty flounced into the lounge and flung herself into an overstuffed chair. Her little dog trotted hot on her heels. Kitty Lane was my new espionage partner. With her blonde ringlets and hand-clapping giggles, you'd think her a sweet schoolgirl. That was until you saw her forensic prowess and foot-fighting skills. We were thrown together by the War Office under direct orders from Captain Hall, the girl's guardian and my boss. Along with Clifford Douglas, our sometimes chauffeur and chaperone, as if we needed either, we were on a mission to follow known German spy and all-round cad, Frederick Fredericks. Trail him and report back. Those were Captain Hall's exact words. Along with, "And no silly disguises, Miss Figg." My disguises came in bally handy. Take my wig, for example. I was wearing one now, my favourite strawberry blonde number. I'd had to shave my head for my first assignment when I was undercover. 6 months later, my poor auburn locks were like pine needles sticking out from my skull. Without at least this wee bit of artifice, I looked a fright. Even Poppy ran from the room. "I'm bored." Kitty threw her head back and raised her hand to her brow like the doomed heroine of a tragic opera. "And so is Poppy. Right, Poppy Poo?" Poppy the Pekingese barked in agreement. Boredom is the result of a lack of imagination. I dropped my detective story magazine into my lap. Either that or indolence. I sniffed. And you, my dear, suffer from neither. Although I'd just met Kitty Lane 2 months ago, and under false pretences, I might add, I knew the girl was as full of energy and mischief as Poppy, the furry beastie who jumped up into her lap and was licking her face. Disgusting. Kitty giggled and kissed the creature's topknot, which was tied up with a pink bow. Obviously, mischief was not the only trait the girl shared with her dog. Her sense of hygiene was as questionable as the pup. She sighed. This place was the Ampezzo Valley of the Dolomite Mountains in northern Italy, and anything but dreary. Rugged snow-covered peaks jutted out of the high plains like majestic overlords, claiming the sky as their inheritance. The rock outcroppings, blood-red sunsets and icicles that hung down from the roof like daggers were a far cry from the deserts of Egypt, or London for that matter, with its crowded streets and thick fog. No, far from dreary, this place was a picture postcard. Kitty bolted upright and pointed at the window. "We'll never get out of here if it doesn't quit snowing." She sighed and leaned back in the chair, sliding her legs over one of its arms. "Maybe that dreamy doctor will stop by again." Clapping her hands in front of her face, she let out a high-pitched squeal. My hands flew to my ears. Good heavens! The girl really did need to learn to stop behaving like such a ninny, especially since she was anything but. She was a crack British agent. Then again, if acting like an idiot was her cover, she was killing it. "Don't screech and sit in that chair properly." I searched my memory for some dreamy doctor. From what I'd seen, it was difficult to find any doctors on the Italian front, dreamy or not. "If only we could have a fancy dress party." Ignoring me, Kitty kicked her feet back and forth. A convalescent spa is hardly the place for a ball. I glanced around the cavernous lounge of the Cortina. Built into the side of a mountain, in the summer, Italy's premier health spa served as a retreat for wealthy Europeans suffering from chest disease. In the winter, one wing housed hearty sorts seeking adventure, while another outbuilding sheltered wounded soldiers suffering chest disease and worse. The war on the Italian front was just as bad as anywhere else. In some ways, it was worse. The Italian front ran along the rugged, rocky mountains between northern Italy and Austria and was better suited to rigorous sportsmanship than war.
Why not?
Her rosebud lips blossomed into a pout.
Joy and beauty are as important to good health as bitter-tasting medicines.
She had a point. Yes, but we have to take the bitter with the sweet. Speaking of bitter, a bitter cold draught whooshed in from under the wooden door, turning the lounge into an icebox. The Cortina's stone walls and high ceilings amplified the harsh winter temperatures. Hard to believe it was a health spa. More like a good place to catch pneumonia. Couldn't they light more fireplaces, for heaven's sake? The war. Every hardship or inconvenience was attributed to the Great War, which had been raging across Europe and beyond for 3 dismal years now. Up until the last 6 months, I'd spent the war stuck filing papers in room 40 of the Admiralty.
Boring.
Kitty kicked at her chair. Here. I thrust the magazine at her. Why don't you read Arthur Conan Doyle's essay about Sherlock Holmes and the process of deduction? As Dr. Watson says, a solution explained is a mystery spoiled. I doubted Mr. Conan Doyle's readers would agree.
Aunt Fiona,
she groaned and waved the magazine away.
I'm too old for children's stories.
I wished she'd quit calling me aunt. A mere 7 years her senior, I was hardly an old maid. The girl was barely 18, but fancied herself a woman of the world. Horse feathers, I scoffed. You could learn a lot about detective.
Ha!
Kitty cut me off.
Orange monkeys don't commit murder and criminals don't go around painting horse heads.
So you do read. Now it was my turn to interrupt. And here I thought you just looked at the pretty pictures in your high fashion rags. I grabbed my magazine and stood up. You could always help out next door at the hospital. The British Army had commandeered an outbuilding next door for a makeshift hospital. Having volunteered at Charing Cross Hospital back in London, I knew firsthand the stomach and stamina it took to care for broken soldiers. Unless you're too squeamish or afraid to walk in the snow, I smirked. Kitty guffawed.
You have no idea.
It was true. I had no idea what the girl had seen or done. She was more of a mystery to me than our current assignment in Italy. This was our 3rd mission together, and I still didn't know if we had the same orders. Judging from what happened in New York, I'd guess not. The blasted girl had tied me to a toilet, for heaven's sake. Don't tell me. I tucked the magazine under my arm. Boarding school in France.
That's right.
She raised her eyebrows and grinned. Marie and I, Miss Marvind. Rumour had it Miss Marie Marvind had once donned a moustache and dressed up as a man and fought on the front lines. A woman after my own heart. I would love to have tea with her and compare moustaches. I rubbed my hands together. Just thinking about my slender case filled with fake facial hair and spirit glue that I had hidden under my bed made me giddy. I couldn't wait for an opportunity to try one of my disguises. Kitty pulled the squirming puppy closer to her breast.
Wasn't she, Poppy Poo?
The girl used an especially annoying high-pitched voice when addressing her dog. Nurse Gabriella told me Miss Marvind flew an air ambulance and may visit us here. I moved closer to the fire and warmed my hands. She taught me to shoot and... Her voice trailed off. She fiddled with the lace on her collar. I bet she's a crack shot. I turned around to warm my backside. A cloud passed over the girl's countenance. Yes, her rosy cheeks had turned bright red. Her lips stretched into a thin line, but she didn't say a word. Apparently, I'd hit a nerve. What's wrong, my dear? What else had this Miss Marvind taught the girl? Whatever it was, Kitty was unusually shy about it. Either she had a secret past with the woman, or her relationship with Miss Marvint was beyond my security clearance.
He was supposed to be here by now.
She picked at the pink ribbon tied around Poppy's topknot.
What if he doesn't show up?
I bit my tongue, fighting the urge to feign ignorance, for I knew exactly who she meant. Frederick Fredericks, of course. South African huntsman, American journalist and German spy. Along with following the bounder, we were to report back on his plans to sabotage the British war efforts. Captain Hall claimed Fredericks was more used to the War Office in the wild than in jail, and that was why I'd followed the bounder halfway across the world and back. Where the devil was he? It wasn't the first time he'd lured us to some far-flung corner of the globe, but it was the first time he hadn't shown up. We'd been waiting for a week. It wasn't like him not to show up. For a liar, he was sinfully honest at times. Perhaps a jealous husband or ambitious spy had finally caught up to him. He was quite the ladies' man. It would serve him right. Posing as a British officer, the rotter was supposed to have been inducted into the Knights of the Supreme Order yesterday at the Basilica Minore di Santi Filippo e Giacomo in the town square. Apparently, he did something to deserve a Catholic religious award. What, I couldn't imagine. Truth be told, he was supposed to be in jail in Cairo for the part he may or may not have played in the murders of 2 British agents. But the sneaky cad had escaped almost 2 weeks ago. He was as slippery as an eel. The War Office thought they could use him to get vital information on Germany's espionage operations. For all I knew, they'd let him escape. After following him for the last 6, the War Office thought they were using him. I knew better. He was using them.
I say,
a familiar voice inserted itself into my consciousness.
I was wondering where you girls had got to.
Pipe in hand, Clifford strode into the lounge. No doubt he'd just come from the hotel bar. Captain Clifford Douglas was tall and lanky, with a long face, receding hairline and prominent chin. In his early 40s, aside from his lively blue eyes, he resembled an aging racehorse. Still, he was a decent sort of chap. If only he could keep his mouth shut. He was a notorious blabbermouth, a quality blessed inconvenient in our line of work. After 5 successful missions, all right, nearly successful missions, I could hold my head up and say my line of work was espionage. Too bad my boss at the War Office wasn't as confident in my work. At least not yet. Poppy jumped off the girl's lap and ran to Clifford. He scooped the pup into his arms.
What if who doesn't show up?
He cooed at the little beastie. If you must know, your best pal Frederick Fredericks. I tightened my lips, thinking of his constant reminiscences about hunting with Fredericks in Africa.
Fredericks is a man of integrity.
Clifford put the dog down and jammed his pipe between his teeth. Fredericks, a man of integrity. That's a laugh. The way he flirted with me, always having me on, you'd think he was in love with me. I put my hand to my cheek. Must be the fire. I was getting rather warm.
If he says he'll be here, he will.
He struck a match.
Mark my words.
After a couple of puffs, he blew out a cloud of foul smoke.
Once, when we were hunting in the Serengeti, the old boy was delayed by a charging rhinoceros.
Please, I waved my hand in front of my face, not another one of your gruesome hunting stories. Red in tooth and claw. Tennyson had it wrong. It's not animals, but men who are the true beasts. I loved my king and country as much as the next girl, but the horrors I'd witnessed at Charing Cross Hospital had quite put me off war. It wasn't exciting. It was bloody heartbreaking. Why do you think your pal, the great hunter, lured us to Italy? The only wildlife I've seen circling about the Cortina was a pair of bearded vultures. He's hardly coming to hunt. No doubt Fredericks had his sights on bigger prey. Double agents were his Clifford warmed his hands in front of the fireplace.
That Catholic do.
That Catholic do was yesterday. You know as well as I that Fredericks is up to something. I roasted in front of the fire.
He always is,
Kitty chimed in. That's why we're chasing him across the globe. The earthy smell of my wool skirt heating up encouraged me to step away from the fire.
Why do you say that?
Clifford looked hurt. He still didn't believe that his old hunting pal could be a German spy. Why he always defended the rotter was beyond me.
Let's see.
I held up my hand and counted off on my fingers.
He killed an English countess at Ravenswick Abbey,
and a Russian countess at a Parisian garden party. He did have a thing for countesses. Bad ones. He might be a killer, but at least he was a principled killer.
I say, no one could prove he did for those two ladies.
Clifford tapped his pipe on the interior wall of the fireplace, and tobacco ash fell to join the wood ashes below.
Then there was that poor nanny in Vienna.
Of course, I had no evidence he was involved in that one. I held up 3 fingers.
And in New York.
Well, he didn't kill anyone there either, but...
Enough.
Kitty stood up.
Frederick Fredericks is guilty as sin and must be stopped.
Speechless, Clifford and I stood staring at the girl. Since we'd arrived in Italy, she'd been as changeable as a January sky. On the surface, Kitty seemed a sweet, bubbly 18-year-old in love with frilly dresses and flirting. Underneath the high-pitched squeals and nervous hand-clapping was an intelligence officer skilled in foot-fighting, forensic science, and heaven knew what else, which was blessed confusing. I never knew if I was annoyed with the girl or the persona she'd created.
He is an enemy of Britain.
She yanked on Poppy's leash.
You two can stay here bickering like an old married couple, but I intend to bring Fredericks to justice.
She stomped off with Poppy in tow. Temper, temper. I shook my head. There was no need to be insulting. Old married couple, my eye. Still, the truth sank in my stomach like a stone. The only reason Captain Hall had continued sending me on assignments was because Frederick Fredericks kept taunting me to follow him by sending personal invitations to operas, royal balls, or fancy induction ceremonies. That, and the fact all able-bodied men were off fighting the Germans. Otherwise, even now, I'd be back in room 40, filing documents and delivering tea to codebreakers. Without him, I'd still be in dreary old London, mourning the end of my marriage. Even so, all that rubbish he spouted about the two of us ending the war. Fredericks was balmy if he thought we had that kind of power. Either he was taunting me, or he was completely potty. I didn't believe for a second that he was in love with me. Ridiculous man. Roar, clank, roar, whoosh. A great commotion outside interrupted my lament. I glanced out of the window. The roaring of an engine was accompanied by a snow devil whirring in the distance. What in heaven's name? Had the Germans lobbed a bomb? I dashed to the window, used my palm to wipe off condensation, and stared out into a wintry world. It was still snowing. The mountains were covered in a blanket of white. A sudden burst of snow blew up from the valley below and enveloped the Cortina in a cloud. I shielded my eyes with my hand, but between the fog on the window and the whirling snow devil, I could barely see the icicles hanging from the roof, let alone what was happening out in the meadow. By the time I turned around, Clifford was already at the front door. Where is he going? As he went out, a frigid gust came in. Shivering, I quickened my pace to fetch my coat, which hung on a hook next to the door. I tugged on my coat and hat, slipped on my gloves, and bolted outside. Brrr! My wool velour trench coat was no match for the wind, and neither was my bare face. Icy snow pelted my skin. My eyes stung and watered, and half-frozen tears burned my cheeks. The air I sucked in clawed at my lungs and stabbed at my ribs. My nostrils crackled. No doubt my nose hairs were turning into tiny stalagmites. I smiled to myself. My mother would turn over in her grave if she knew I'd even thought of nose hairs. I pulled my coat tighter. The engine sputtered and then changed pitch from a deep roar to a metallic whine. I followed the sound. Eventually, I made out Clifford's silhouette up ahead. Reassured, I lowered my head and charged through the blowing snow toward the meadow. At least, I hoped I was heading toward the meadow.
Wait for me!
The last gasps of the dying engine drowned out my voice. Blasted! Snow had breached my lace-up leather boots. Not stopping, I reached down, hopped on one leg, and tried to fling the icy intruder away from my ankle. And I thought soggy London was hard on footwear. Ruined. My favourite boots would be ruined. When I caught up to Clifford, he was standing arms akimbo, watching the final rotations of an airplane's propellers.
One of ours?
I shielded my eyes and raised my voice to be heard. I'd never seen an airplane up close. It looked like a giant rickety wooden bird. How in the world did that contraption get airborne? Must be a crack pilot to land in this weather. Wearing a plush fur coat and a hat that covered his entire head except for his ruddy face, the pilot sat high up in the cockpit. He snapped his goggles up onto his forehead.
Oh, hi there!
His voice was high and tinny. He waved and then jumped down from the cockpit and ran around to help his passenger out of the back seat. Frozen in place, with my mouth hanging open, I watched what could have been a scene from an American war movie. His handlebar moustache, white with frost, the passenger was encased in brown fur and wore big goggles. He was nearly twice the size of the pilot. When he alighted from the airplane, a cloud of snow flew up in all directions. My teeth chattered. I hugged myself but couldn't take my eyes off the aviators. Like a pair of brown bears, the pilot and his passenger trudged over to where we were standing. The passenger ripped off his bomber hat and goggles and grinned at me.
Fiona, ma chérie.
His long black curls fell around his broad shoulders.
How good of you to come.
He took my gloved hand and made a great show of kissing it. Crikey! I should have known. Frederick Fredericks. The cad always had to make a grand entrance. He stood there with a smug look on his face, a look I knew all too well, a look like a panther might give a goat, a look that made me light-headed. Ridiculous man.
You're late.
I tightened my lips.
Apologies.
He glanced over at the pilot.
Something came up. Frederick's old man.
Clifford extended his hand.
I told the girls you'd be here. Girls?
Fredericks pulled off his thick gloves and shook Clifford's hand.
Ah, the irrepressible Kitty Lane.
He flashed a mischievous smile.
Kitty's here?
The pilot joined us.
Delightful.
I'd heard she might be here. How did he know Kitty? I must say, the girl got around. When it came to young men, she was irrepressible, all right. An irrepressible flirt. The pilot removed his hat to reveal a long brown fringe parted down the middle and... Wait a minute. A messy chignon twisted up at the back. What? The lively eyes betrayed an otherwise plain face, but it was the sly smile, thin eyebrows, and that voice. Yes, the voice that ultimately gave him away. The pilot was not a man at all. She was a woman. She winked and extended a gloved hand. Mary Marvint at your service. I just stood there blinking like an idiot. Miss Marie Marvint, Kitty's ski instructor from France, the famous woman aviator and inventor of the air ambulance. And you are? She cocked her head and raised a thin eyebrow.
Fiona.
I finally managed to croak out my name.
Fiona Figg.
Chapter 2. White Friday.
Lean forward, not back.
Clifford reached down and offered me his hand. I took it and pulled myself up. The skis slid out from under me again, and I landed back on my bottom. Who came up with the balmy idea to attach boards to their feet and climb snow-covered mountains?
Need help, Aunt Fiona?
Kitty skidded to a stop right next to me, spraying me with snow in the process. Ridiculous. How did everyone know how to ski except for me? Not wanting to admit that I did indeed need help, and lots of it, I shook my head. Taking a deep breath, I resolved to right myself on my own. The pain in my lungs from inhaling frozen air motivated me to try harder. To think, if Frederick Fredericks hadn't taken off on skis this morning just after breakfast, I could be huddled by the fire reading the latest Sherlock Holmes story and sipping a lovely cuppa, instead of lying in a snowbank freezing my backside. To keep up with Fredericks, and everyone else it seemed, I must master snow skiing within the hour. I propped myself against my hands and leaned back. I had to lie on the ground to get the right angle to swing my giant boarded feet around in front of me. After that monumental effort, I needed a rest. Sigh, I fell back against the snowbank and stared up at the bluest sky I'd ever seen. Thankfully, the snow had stopped, and the bright winter sun provided some warmth. The glistening peaks and valley were achingly beautiful, transcendent even, rising high above the stone chimneys of the village below. Even the basilica's bell tower and Moorish domes were dwarfed by the splendour of God's own spires, the magnificent Dolomites. Such a romantic scene. I wished Archie were here, my beloved Lieutenant Archie Summersby. It had only been 2 weeks since I'd seen him in Cairo on Christmas Day. We'd been under the mistletoe, and he'd asked me, "After the war is over, do you think you would do me the honour?" That's when Kitty had interrupted and ruined everything. Or had she saved? I reminded myself that I wasn't here on holiday and pushed off from the snowbank. I held my right hand out for balance, shifted my weight forward and managed to crouch over my skis. With all my might and determination, I willed myself straight up from squatting to standing. By some miracle, I didn't fall over. I brushed the snow off the back of my woolen skirt. Too bad I wasn't wearing one of my male disguises. At least then I'd be wearing trousers and a full beard to warm my face. I surveyed the ski tracks leading into the forest. One advantage of fresh snow: it was easy to see Frederick's tracks. If only I could stay upright, following him would be a cakewalk.
Just lift your heel and glide.
Clifford was the paragon of patience. And yet even with his good humour and constant instruction, I'd just managed to ski across the driveway, if you counted slipping, cursing, and eventually just carrying the blasted things over my shoulder. I wasn't even certain I'd made it across the drive. With the new snow, it was impossible to tell. I'd been at it since breakfast, which must have been barely an hour ago, yet my stomach kept telling me it was time for luncheon. I pushed up my glove and glanced at my watch. Fredericks had an hour's head start, and he was a crack skier. He'd left without a word. Did he invite me to the mountains just to toy with me? What a stupid question. Of course he did. He took great delight in watching me squirm like one of his trophies caught in a trap. No doubt he was meeting someone, perhaps an Austrian or German, at the border. Our enemy. We were at the Italian front, after all, and the border between Italy and Austria was in play. A central theatre of war. What metaphors! Play. Theatre. There was nothing entertaining about men killing each other. I slid one foot forward and didn't fall. Encouraged, I tried the other foot. At this rate, it would take me a week to catch up to Fredericks. The War Office should have prepared me for this assignment with skiing lessons. Of course, I'd come straight from Cairo and there'd been no time, not to mention no snow, although I'd heard Marie Marvint once skied in the Sahara Desert. Of course she did. Tentatively, I moved my right foot forward a few inches. My ankle quivered, but I kept my balance. When I tried to move my left foot, I had to catch myself with a ski pole to avoid another spill. Deuced unnerving. The soldiers skiing in and out of Ampezzo Valley made it look so easy. Expert skiers had come from all over the Allied world. The Americans and the French Pyrenees to fight the Austrians on the Italian front. No wonder they called it the White War. I tried again, this time using my ski poles as ballast. Shuffling my feet and flapping my wings, I must have looked like a blue booby trying to take flight. Done well, skiing was the most graceful of sports. Done poorly, it was an abomination. Boom, roar, crash. A thundering explosion ripped down the mountainside. I gasped and my hand flew to my mouth. Bloody war. We were being bombed by the Germans, and here I was lying in a snowbank. Well, not at this very minute, but no doubt soon. The noise had come from the forest. I stared in that direction, wondering how close we were to the fighting.
"Aunt Fiona! Uncle Clifford!"
Kitty shouted, emerging from the trees.
"Come quickly! There's been an accident!"
Avalanche!
Marie Marvint shooshed to a stop right behind her.
We need all hands on deck.
She waved her ski pole.
Dépêchez-vous! Hurry! You too, Figg!
They both did some fancy kick turn with their skis and then disappeared back into the forest. Avalanche? How dreadful. Clifford took off toward the trees. After a couple of strides, he stopped and turned back.
Come on, old girl. You can do it.
Good old Clifford. He always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself.
Did I ever tell you about the time in Norway when I went shooting on skis?
I ignored him and concentrated on the task. Without daring to lift a heel or bend a toe, I scooted my skis along in Clifford's tracks, moving at a snail's pace. Still, Clifford waited. As much as his nattering annoyed me, he was a jolly good fellow.
Keep your skis in my tracks and you'll be fine.
His long, graceful glides made it look as easy as dancing. Using my poles as anchors, I scuttered along behind. Once we entered the forest, like a reassuring embrace, the trees on either side of the path buoyed me up. The forest path was a welcome change from the great white expanse of the meadow. My vision, narrowed by a tunnel of snow-laden branches, like a horse wearing blinders, I was able to concentrate on forward motion. Soon, instead of shivering, I was perspiring. Amazing I could be hot when it was freezing. The sweet smell of spruce lingered under the nose-tickling cold of fresh snow. Even the sound of snow was different, muffled and muted. The paradox of winter. The whole world became both cold and cruel, and yet quiet and soft. By the time we emerged from the forest into a clear, another word my mother would never tolerate, proper young ladies don't sweat.
"Over here!"
Kitty waved her ski poles in the air. Above the tree line, jagged peaks poked up behind a vertical sheet of snow. The mountainside was smooth and glistening, except for one rough patch that looked like a giant paw had torn it loose. At the bottom, a mound of square snow tiles piled into a great domino heap. Down on their knees, 4 or 5 men clawed at the snow with their gloved hands. Just behind them, sticking out of the snow, their pairs of skis formed crosses, a graveyard for the ones trapped beneath. Clifford popped off his skis and raced to help. A square-faced, bare-chested man chewing a cigar barked orders. His head was bare and his wiry hair stood on end. I shivered just looking at him. Potty bloke. Why did men go about thinking they could take off their shirts? Unseemly, if you asked me. Even Fredericks was on hands and knees, digging in the snow, trying to save the soldiers who had been the victims of the avalanche. So, this is where he went on skis early this morning. I'd caught up to him after all. I glanced around. Could this snow-covered mountain have been his destination? Of course, the avalanche was an accident. But somehow Fredericks always managed to be at the centre of any trouble. Bending down, I tried to loosen my boots from the bindings. How do I get these blooming things off? Teetering against one ski pole, I nearly lost my balance. Again. It was astounding how difficult it was to get up once one fell. Gravity itself turned out to be the enemy. The solution was not to fall. Cheers from the crowd made me look up. Wait. Who's that, up on the ridge? A figure dressed in dark clothes and a bright red cap stood atop the ridge. I blinked, and he was gone. I must have been imagining things. Either that, or he'd skied out of sight. More cheering. The rescue party had dragged someone out from under the snowy tomb. Marie Marvint alternately pounded on his chest and slapped his face. She was magnificent. After 3 rounds of pounding and slapping, the man came to with a great rasping gasp.
"Here's another,"
Kitty shouted. She was on her knees, scooping snow with both hands. Poking out from under the snow, parts of a uniform were visible. Then a hand, and then a face. Ripping off my skis, I swam upstream through the deep snow to the poor soul. His face was bluish, but his skin was still warm. Dropping to my knees, I replicated Marie's technique of... Of course, I'd seen men die at Charing Cross Hospital, but never of avalanche asphyxiation. A mop of dark hair sticking out of his hat, the young soldier couldn't have been more than 20 years old. I pounded harder with both fists at once. "Don't die on me," I said under my breath. "Come on, soldier. Look alive." The young man's eyes fluttered open. Full of terror, he stared up at me and gasped. "You're okay now?" I patted him on the chest. "You're all right." Another round of cheers went up. All smiles, Marie held out her hand to me. "Good job, Figg." For the rest of the afternoon, we dug and dragged men out from under the snow. None of them were as lucky as those first 2. By the time we could extricate the other 3 from the mountainside, they had died from their wounds or from lack of oxygen.
White Friday, all over again.
The young soldier sat watching rescue efforts while sipping coffee from Marie's thermos. White Friday? I was afraid to ask.
You don't want to know.
Tears formed frozen rivulets on his face. Don't fret, son. I used my best maternal tone with the poor lad. What's your name?
Emilio.
His voice trailed off. He'd suffered a broken leg, which Marie and I had immobilized using a tree branch and Clifford's belt.
My friend is buried under there.
Emilio put his head in his hands and sobbed. There, Emilio. I patted his arm. It will be all right. Of course, I knew it wouldn't. No one touched by this bloody war was all right. By dusk, our rescue attempts were sagging. Demoralized, we worked in silence. Exhausted, cold, hungry, fingers numb from digging, I tried not to think of the loved ones these boys left behind. Mothers, wives, girlfriends. My shoulders slumped. Such a pity. I thought of Archie. For all I knew, he was buried under 6 feet of snow or lying in a ditch somewhere. I cringed and went back to digging. At twilight, we had to call off our efforts and head back to the Cortina, lest we too freeze to death. Marie and Kitty had skied back to the hospital and returned with 2 toboggan stretchers consisting of canvas taut across 2 poles attached to skis. We all helped load the 2 men we'd managed to rescue onto the sleds. Once we had both men loaded, Fredericks grabbed the rope attached to the yoke of one stretcher and tied it around his waist. Marie did the same with the second stretcher. Kitty helped stabilize the sleds. I was in awe as they skied the injured men through the forest and back, some of us further behind than the others. Later that evening, the mood at dinner was sombre. You could hear every clink or clank of every fork or knife in the otherwise quiet dining room. The snow wasn't the only thing that muted the world. With its windowless stone walls, illuminated only by candlelight, the dining room felt like a large cave. Usually most of the long wooden tables were filled with soldiers, many of them convalescing and recovering from war wounds. This evening, the avalanche rescue party were dining early to warm up and recover from the ordeal. Sitting on hard wooden benches, we occupied just 2 tables. My entire body ached from today's exertions. I was half tempted to leave dinner and go straight to bed, but my stomach had other ideas, and the smells coming from the kitchen were heavenly. Fresh baked bread and roasted garlic. I sat at one table with Kitty, Clifford, Marie Marvint, and, of course, the meddlesome Frederick Fredericks. The rest of the rescue party was at another. "Why were you out on the mountain this morning?" I asked Fredericks, not that he would tell me the truth.
"Taking my morning exercise."
He grinned.
"I have to stay in shape to keep up with you, ma chérie."
He took a slow, sensual sip of his cocktail and then licked his lips. Cheeky devil. I'd say it was the other way around. No matter how hard I tried, I was always one step behind him.
"Isn't it exhilarating?"
When he tilted his head, a lock of ebony hair fell over his shoulder.
"The thrill of the chase?"
"The chase?" I scoffed. "Who is the predator and who is the prey?" The way he leered at me, I knew the answer. A shiver ran up my spine.
"Depends. I aim to please."
His dark eyes filled with mischief.
"Which do you prefer?"
The heat spreading over my chest and up my neck made me turn away. Ahem. I resisted the urge to look back and instead surveyed the dining room. At the neighbouring table, 3 soldiers with their heads together whispered as the cigar-chewing man across from them scribbled in a notebook. Next to the scribbler sat a petite man whose hair stood up a good 3 inches off his head, and his scraggly beard had the look of something obscene. His animated paramour was beautiful in a pensive and intense sort of way. At the end of the table, a sad woman sat staring into her lap as if she'd just been scolded by her father. Beside her, a rather pale-looking, square-faced boy played with a wooden spoon. One of the wounded soldiers laughed at something his pal said. With his easy smile, and when I'd first met Lieutenant Archie Summersby at Charing Cross Hospital, he too had been recovering from an injured arm. Despite his injury, he had comforted me on one of the worst nights of my life, the night my husband, my cheating husband, had died in my arms. Where was my dear Archie now? Oh, Archie. A maelstrom of emotions tightened around my heart. I was drawn to him like no other. Yet what did I really know about him? I knew he was an assassin. How could I be in love with a killer? To force my thoughts away from Archie, I addressed my table mates. What did the poor lad mean by White Friday?
"Rum do that."
Clifford dropped the dinner roll he was buttering and laid his knife across the edge of his plate.
"Nearly 2,000 men lost in one go. Soldiers from both sides."
The Italians purposely set off charges to cause that avalanche. Frederick stopped mid-bite and waved his knife in the air.
"Using an avalanche as a weapon is undignified and unjust."
"Banana." The cook's mousy assistant delivered big bowls of soup from a tray. "Red soup?" Sable curls poked out from her white cap as she delivered a warm smile along with each bowl. It was a wonder such a petite young lady could so deftly wield such large bowls. When she approached the second table, her demeanour changed from cheerful to dour. Without ceremony, she plunked a bowl in front of each of the men. The cigar-chewing man winked at her. She flinched. Hand over her mouth, she scurried from the room. I didn't blame her. Poor girl. Surrounded by soldiers, she must have to put up with all kinds of harassment and unpleasant advances.
"I'm sure Fiona will agree," Frederick said. "Setting off an avalanche is undignified and unjust."
The sound of my name brought me back to our table. Is there anything dignified or just about war? I blew on a spoonful of soup. Dignified war. Just war. Only in fiction. In reality, war was always barbaric.
"Not where the British are concerned."
Fredericks held up his bread roll and ripped it in half.
"They promised Italy these northern territories in exchange for fighting the Austrians up in this godforsaken place."
He slathered one half with butter and popped it into his mouth.
"Steady on, mate."
Clifford came to our defence. Fredericks held up a hand while he chewed and swallowed.
"A promise they can't keep, as usual."
More than once, Fredericks had told me about how, as a boy, he'd watched as the British Army slaughtered his entire family during the Boer Wars. I truly am. I sipped a spoonful of soup. But really, Fredericks, must you always—" A commotion from the doorway interrupted me. All heads turned. Dressed in a white uniform, Gabriella, a tall, moon-faced nurse with bright red lips, escorted the 2 avalanche survivors, one on each arm. At the sight of the trio, the diners broke out in applause. Nurse Gabriella helped the men to our table. One of the lads had a bandage around his head. The other, Emilio, was wearing a plaid cap, had a splint on his lower leg, and leaned on a crutch. Seeing the 2 up and about lifted my spirits considerably. After Nurse Gabriella got the 2 men settled at the end of the table, she tapped a knife on a wineglass. "Ladies and gentlemen," she tapped again. A hush fell over the dining room. "The Princess of the Moon has spared these 2 souls from the Pale Mountains." Her voice broke. "Emilio and Tommaso would like to thank you for saving their lives." She gave each man a tiny pine cone. "May the forest elves watch over you." Princess of the Moon? Was she referring to herself? The diners broke into applause again, a long round of applause. The soldiers cheered. The owner of the hotel, Mrs. Capri, appeared in the doorway, a matronly woman smelling of yeast who rarely smiled. She ran the place from her rooms at the back of the hotel. She had lost her husband in the war and kept herself to herself. As usual, she was dressed in widow's weeds. She scanned the dining room. "Due to a head injury," the nurse bowed her head, "Tommaso has temporarily lost his memory." She paused. "I thought we could help him by introducing, or reintroducing ourselves." Mrs. Capri disappeared from the doorway, obviously not ready for reintroductions. "Buonasera." The nurse put her hand on the good captain's shoulder. "I'm Nurse Gabriella Rossi. I grew up in the shadow of the Marmoroles, protected by Tana, Queen of the Mountains and bearer of the Blue Crown." With her Italian accent and lilting voice, it sounded like an incantation. She nodded at me. Enjoying the warmth of the delicious bread soup, I felt caught out like a schoolgirl reading a detective story instead of paying attention. I swallowed and dabbed at my mouth with my napkin. "Fiona Figg, file clerk." File clerk? Really, Fiona? Of course, it was true, but what would an English file clerk be doing in the mountains of Italy during a war? I couldn't very well say I was a spy, now could I? "And volunteer nurse," I added. Not as romantic as the Princess of the Moon or bearer of the Blue Crown, but the best I could do at the moment. Going round the table, Clifford, Kitty and Frederick took turns introducing themselves. Kitty said she was my niece, who'd come along to learn battlefield nursing. Was she having a laugh? The girl couldn't stand the sight of needles. Clifford nattered on about his various odd jobs before the war, his banking position and then his army days. "Took shrapnel," he slapped his knee. "Bum leg, don't you know?" When it was his turn, Fredericks made a great show of flicking his napkin in the air like a stage performer doing a magic trick. "Journalist by trade, hunter by passion. He guided former American President Theodore Roosevelt on safari." Clifford beamed, obviously chuffed at his pal. "Once, in the savannah—" I kicked him under the table. "Ouch!" He grimaced. When would he see the awful truth and quit worshipping the great hunter? "Mary Mavint, aviator, sportswoman and soldier." She saluted the men. "At least until they discovered I was a woman." She laughed. What a woman. I aspired to be as daring as she. At our table, only she knew Captain Tommaso Conti. Her countenance turned sober as she praised him for his bravery and service to the Allied forces. As she spoke, she kept glancing back at Kitty. Behind her abstract praise, I got the distinct impression there was something else, something she wasn't saying. In contrast, at the second table, everyone knew Captain Conti. All 3 of the soldiers had served under him. In turn, they recounted stories of their dealings with the injured man. A reprimand, shared binoculars, a lost button. From the impersonal nature of their anecdotes, Captain Tommaso Conti sounded like a man who kept to himself. Either that, or his men were afraid to talk about him out of turn. Reprimand, shared binoculars, and lost button told stories